I had to be the one to propose marriage to my first husband. That's really typical of my love life. Obviously, there's been no shortage of men in my life, good ones and bad ones, handsome men, ugly men. But those who wanted to marry me, usually I didn't love them. I didn't love them enough. And those whom I would have liked to have married, either they didn't love me or they weren't free. So at the end of every love affair, I found myself more alone than ever, hurting just a little more, just enough to make my love songs more poignant. I went from one man to another, hoping passionately I could stay with one of them. But I didn't succeed, and gradually I became a little more desperate. When I met Jacques Pills, I just lived through one more love affair that had come to an end. It happened after my terrible car accident near Tarascon, when I'd been taken back to my overgrand house in Boulogne. I remained alone in my bed with my arm in plaster, my broken ribs, my morphine injections, and my ever-deepening unhappiness following the death of Cerdan. A man had got into the habit of coming to see me every day for several hours, and his presence did me good. He was slender and attractive. His sad expression had drawn me to him. He was a famous cyclist, and I prefer not to mention his name in order to save embarrassment to his family and his children. One evening he told me, "I love you. I know there's no sense in this because I'm married, but I can't stop myself from thinking of you." I loved him too. We were lovers, of course, but this new love, which lasted a year, did not bring me much real happiness, for my champion could not succeed in making up his mind. He didn't dare cause any hurt to his wife, and at the same time he didn't want to give me up. So he went back to her whenever I went on tour and left her again as soon as I returned to Paris. I loved him in spite of everything. Early, every morning, I would sit in my car at the edge of the lake in the Bois de Boulogne and watch my cyclists training. He would say to me, "It's good to see a team of cyclists going by." And I would agree. He would talk to me about his competitions, about gear ratios. He wanted me to hold the stopwatch. It wasn't very entertaining for me, but I wanted to please him. I did everything he wanted. And then one afternoon, the police knocked on my door. It was the same old story. My champion had brought his things to my house, and his wife had laid a complaint. I was accused of receiving. They wanted to arrest me. Our story took a turn for the worse. Now we could only meet in secret, with our coat collars turned up, taking the service staircase after car chases which were as terrifying as they were ridiculous. It was like a third-rate film. No love can hold out against such things. Gradually, ours faded away. It was at this moment that Jacques Pills rang my doorbell. It was May 1952. He had just come back from the U.S. "I've written a song for you," he said. "Listen to it." His pianist, an unknown man called Gilbert Bécaud, sat down at the piano, and Pills sang to me "Jeté dans la peau." I liked the song. For 2 weeks, Pills came to the house to rehearse me. But each time, instead of working, we talked about ourselves. And we looked at each other. I was in love again. This time I said to myself, "This is it. I've found the love of my life, the man I'll be able to live with all my life. A husband, at last." But Jacques was shy. I could see clearly that he was dying to talk to me about love. His lips would part, and I'd think, "He's going to make a declaration." But no. His Adam's apple would tremble. He would swallow and remain silent. This performance went on for a fortnight. In the end, as he was leaving me one evening, he said, "I love you." And he sounded almost angry. Then I answered him spontaneously, "You have to prove your love, Jacques. If I asked you to marry me, would you accept?" Jacques took me in his arms and replied, laughing like a child, "Whenever you want, wherever you want." I found him absolutely adorable. I shall always remember our wedding day in New York in October 1953. Shortly before the ceremony, I could see that Jacques was worried about something. He was restless. He sighed. "You're hiding something from me," I said. Then, looking down at the floor, shamefaced, Jacques admitted it. "Didou, I told you a lie." I was already imagining some last-minute catastrophe, and I saw my happiness about to vanish. Then, with the guilty look of a schoolboy who's been found out, Jacques murmured, "I lied to you about my age. I told you I was 39. And in fact, I'm 46. Dear Jacques, he had thought he had to make himself younger in order to attract me. I had always been told that for a young girl the most wonderful day of her life was her wedding day. Had I ever been a young girl? All the same, my wedding day was really the most wonderful day of my life. I felt purified, regenerated. I wore a pale blue dress. This scandalized many people, but I had dreamed so much about that dress. I hadn't even had a white dress for my first communion, you understand, for at that point in my life I was on the road, following my acrobat father from village to village and taking the collection after his performances. I wanted to wear a light-colored dress on my wedding day because I wanted to wipe out memories of that wretched and sordid past. I thought I could start again from scratch. People thought I was cynical and deceitful. I was just romantic and credulous. I wore around my neck the little gold cross set with rubies, which Marlene Dietrich, my witness, had just given to me to wish me luck. I clutched this cross nervously with one hand, while with the other I held Jacques' hand tightly, and I prayed feverishly, "Dear God, only let it be true. Only let me be happy. May I never be alone again, ever, ever." I was happy with Jacques. Yes, despite all my tribulations, I did know the quiet happiness of young married couples, and Jacques was marvelous. He didn't try to stifle me. He'd understood that I couldn't tolerate being in a cage, that as soon as I felt shut in, I would run away and smash everything. He didn't try to stop me living and thinking. Yet I think that I often made him unhappy, without wanting to, but he was as solid as a rock. I don't know if you're like me, but when someone displeases me, when someone seems unacceptable to me, I have to tell them. Sometimes in smart restaurants or fashionable bars, I would take a dislike to a particular face. Obviously, that put Jacques in an embarrassing situation. He was so courteous. On those occasions, our conversations always started in the same way. I would go on the attack, suddenly making a discovery about someone sitting at the next table. "Don't you think that chap looks awful?" "Yes," Jacques would reply in a conciliatory tone. "But be good, please. Don't go and tell him so." "No, I shan't be good, and I'll go and tell him what I think of him." "Edith, please." "No, I can't stand the sight of him." I would get up, or else I would call out from my table, "You're a horrible sight!" Jacques would invariably smile at the person I was insulting. He made excuses to him, trying to avoid too much trouble. For a woman of my age, I really behaved like a child. It has to be said that I was not always in a normal state, especially during the periods when I took drugs. In the evenings, while I was having a high old time with my friends in my drawing room, Jacques would take refuge in a small corner of my apartment. He never protested or showed any irritation at the noise. He took a piano into the little room and worked there. He rehearsed on his own, singing and playing quietly. This attitude was in no way a weakness on his part. On the contrary, after Cerdan, Jacques was the strongest, the most reliable man I ever met. Moreover, without him, I'd be dead. It was he who forced me to give up drugs. It was he who made me go 3 times to a clinic for a cure. And if it had been necessary, he would have sent me there a 4th time. He filled me with unlimited confidence. He was the only person to whom I recounted my whole life, without lying, without deception. I would tell him everything. He didn't judge other people. He tried to understand them. It's a rare quality, I know from experience. But one day, I knew that my happiness would not last much longer. I've always been superstitious, I admit it. Events have usually proved me right. However, at the moment when I realized that my last days of happiness had come, we were still very happy. But that day, Jacques was not wearing his wedding ring. Oh, he had taken it off, as certain husbands do, when they meet another woman. But for me it was a great shock, a violent shock. The thing was, on the evening after our wedding, I had asked him to make me a promise. Swear to me that you'll never take off your wedding ring. It would bring us bad luck. And he had promised. Now on that day, which was 2 years later, I was in a film being made in Vichy. And on the last day of filming, I went to rejoin Jacques. He was about to go on stage. I looked at him lovingly. He smiled at me with tenderness, and at that moment the dresser came into the dressing room and said, "Don't forget to take off your wedding ring, Monsieur Pills." He obeyed her immediately, like a man who was accustomed to making this gesture. So he had not kept his promise. He had agreed to take off his wedding ring when he went on stage to sing. I closed my eyes to avoid seeing Jacques' face become tense. I closed my eyes to hide my terrible tears. But at the precise moment, I had the terrible presentiment that our love was over, that it was rushing headlong towards catastrophe. And I was right. 2 months later, we divorced. Once again, love between 2 stars had died, because we had not been physically together often enough to keep it going. Jacques and I did not meet anymore. Our professional work separated us. I was singing at the Versailles in New York, and Jacques was appearing at La Vie en Rose. No doubt, it had been a bad sign. When a husband and wife don't see each other every night, they can no longer keep their love going. In addition, for me, Jacques' presence was something I missed terribly when he wasn't there anymore, so I fell into my former feeble state, a kind of unconsciousness, weakness, and bad memories came back up into my mind like bubbles bursting on the surface of a pond. I felt alone again. I remembered again all my emotional failures, Cerdan's death, and I sought consolation. When Jacques learned that someone in my entourage was making advances to me and that I didn't dislike him, he spoke to me with such sadness in his voice that I blushed for shame. "Zidou," he said, "before catastrophe overwhelms us, we'd better separate." He looked at me for a long time, kissed my hand, and then added, "It's stronger than you are. You'll always play with love." He wasn't altogether wrong, but I paid dearly for that game. I've wept many tears since that separation. I've suffered in body and in soul. And if I didn't now have Theo, After Jacques, my long pursuit of love began again, but it was as if I was blindfolded for a game of blind man's buff. For some time I thought it was love, but it wasn't. I broke free and I began to live again, my arms stretched out towards another man. I could mention names that have become famous, others that have remained obscure. What's the use? It's always the same old story, or nearly so. Yet there was one man who was very dear to me, and I was to lose him, like Cerdan, in an air crash. He was Douglas Davis. He came into my life at the moment when a man had just caused me the most intense suffering. I don't even want to mention his name anymore. One evening, he had dealt me the most cruel blow. It was February 1958. I had just been taken ill on stage at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. The doctors, who had been summoned at once, issued the following command. You must be operated on tomorrow. It's very serious. As I lay in bed, exhausted, I asked this man a question. He had been living close to me for a year. Tell me, do you still love me? I asked. He didn't even look at me. You don't exist for me any more, he threw at me dryly. You know that very well. Life's like that. I was in a state of collapse. Next day I was taken to the Presbyterian Hospital on 168th Street. I hoped I would die during the operation. When I regained consciousness, Loulou Barrier, my impresario, was at my bedside. Loulou, I said to him, there must be one nice man in the world. Loulou tried to comfort me, and then he left. He had barely gone from my room when the telephone rang. It was Loulou. I've just met the nice man you were looking for, he said. He's in the elevator. He's coming. On his way down, Loulou had found at the reception desk a young American painter called Doug Davis, who had asked him shyly for permission to paint my portrait. Doug was already knocking at my door. As I saw his naive expression, his friendly smile, I felt that I still wanted to laugh. Every evening for a month he crossed New York on the subway in order to keep me company for 2 hours. I kissed him for the first time when he arrived with 5 colored balloons floating in the air at the end of their strings. He'd carried them through the subway, although people had laughed at him. He'd bought them for me because I had told him how red balloons had been my childhood dream, but that my father would never buy them for me. That day I was taken for Doug's daughter. Patients who had seen me go by a few days earlier, looking so small under the sheet as I was wheeled towards the operating theater, thought that I was a child. When they saw Doug carrying his balloons, they asked him, "How is your little girl?" Doug and I loved each other for a year, but I lost him in the stupidest way possible. During my summer tour, we had a quarrel in Bordeaux. Doug left the hotel in a fury. I ran after him. I tried to find him on the station platform, but I couldn't find him in the crowd, and the train left for Paris. Immediately afterwards, I fell ill again. Doug was already in New York, where he was having an exhibition. When he came back to Paris, we were no more than just friends. And then on June 3rd, 1962, the telephone rang. Once more, a man I had loved was dead. Doug's plane had crashed at Orly a few minutes after takeoff.